Hello, welcome to our event, Spirituality as Land, Story, and Relation. I'd first like to acknowledge that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Niigaanwewidam Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters we now call Montreal. So this is our first of a series of presentations that we have titled Spirituality as Land, Story, and Relation. And we are honored to have Dr. Niigaan Sinclair as our first speaker. My name is Christine Jameson, and I'm a professor in the Department of Theological Studies at Concordia University in Montreal. My Indigenous roots are with the Boothroyd Band, which is part of the Niigaanwewidam First Nation in the Fraser Canyon in British Columbia. The Department of Theological Studies is hosting this series of events made possible by the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science through her Fund for Special Projects and Events. Before I introduce Niigaan, I would like to welcome Dr. Philippe Gagnon, who is Associate Dean for Student Academic Services. He is also the Academic Director for the Center for Teaching and Learning. Dr. Gagnon will say a few words on behalf of the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science.
Thank you, Christine, and good evening, everyone, and welcome. I am pleased to be here representing Dr. Pascal Sicot, our Dean in the Faculty of Arts and Science, and to be part of the first event in the Spirituality as Land, Story, and Relation series. This series is made possible through our faculty's special projects and event funds. With this fund, we support activities that take our students and our community outside the classroom and into dynamic exchanges with guests that challenge and expand our thinking and move us to effect change. The speakers in this series bring a variety of perspectives and experiences to the topic of spirituality and indigeneity. As our faculty and Concordia travel the path towards decolonizing and indigenizing the university, this series demonstrates the power of storytelling to build understanding. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic has emphasized the inequities that exist in our society. And we, in the Faculty of Arts and Science, believe that the university has a critical role to play in creating conditions leading to equity and justice for all. What better framework to examine multi-faced relationships like spirituality and indigeneity than through the humanities? The exchanges made possible through this event series by the Department of Theological Studies will serve to shift and reshape our attitude and drive us to be change makers locally and we hope globally. I would like to thank Dr. Jamieson and Dr. Anderson for curating this series and our guest, Dr. Sinclair, for being with us tonight. Bon événement.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Thank you for that message. And I just want to say one word about housekeeping before I introduce Dr. Sinclair. Just in terms of questions and answers, we will be having about a 40 to 45 minute presentation by Niigaan, and then we will have about a 20-minute opportunity for you to ask questions and answers. So you'll notice at the bottom of the screen a little box where you can write your questions there, and we have Dr. Matthew Anderson and Scott Royal who will be moderating the questions, and they will be given to Dr. Sinclair when he finishes his speech. So we'll have about 20 minutes, but it would be good if you can ask your questions when they occur to you and write them in the box, so we'll have them ahead of time. So it's really an honor to be able to introduce our first speaker for this series. Niigaan James Sinclair is Anishinaabe, St. Peter's Little Peguis in Manitoba, and he is Associate Professor at the University of Manitoba. He is an award-winning writer, editor, and activist who was named one of Monaco Magazine's Canada's top 20 most influential people. And he won the 2018 Canadian Columnist of the Year at the National Newspaper Awards for his bi-weekly columns in the Winnipeg Free Press. In 2019, he won Peace Educator of the Year from the Peace and Justice Studies Association based at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He is an international media commentator as a part of the Power Panel on CBC's Power and Politics and National Affairs Panel on CBC's The Current. He is also a former secondary school teacher who has trained educators and students across Canada. So we're very, very happy to have you here, Niigaan, and really looking forward to your presentation. And the title of Niigaan's talk is Through Pandemics and Trauma, Indigenous Futures Cannot Be Stopped, and Here's Why. Thank you.
Okay. So bonjour Debwe magaraduk Niigaanwewidam James Sinclair Omayayin Aganabach Bungi Nibin Agwajing Zukapon Agwajing. It's our relatives are coming, and I want to just acknowledge this beautiful territory in which I'm in. I'm in Treaty 1 territory, which is in southern Manitoba, or what we refer to as Manitowapow. And one of the most unfair things of this pandemic by far has been that I get to speak in Montreal, but not be in Montreal. And as a person who is a huge fan of being there, spending time with all the community out there, particularly my Haudenosaunee relations, it's very disappointing that I can't be with all of you today, but I also am very privileged and honored that you still continued with this series and you continue to support and engage Indigenous knowledge by talking about it in your series. So what I want to do is I want to just draw attention over here to my slideshow, because I only have 40 minutes. So I don't want to spend too much time sort of reflecting upon my sadness over not being over with you. Tonight my talk is about pandemics and trauma, and how Indigenous peoples are disproportionately experiencing those kinds of things through this pandemic, but yet through resilience, through what we have always been, our stories, our initiatives, our very cultural fabric. We are thriving in many cases in this pandemic to the best that you can. And this particular time period is, for many reasons, was expected to be a brutal time. It was expected to be a time in which Indigenous peoples were expected to suffer greatly. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why the expectation was that the case. And yet Indigenous communities have been fighting through and have been doing, on the whole, oftentimes as good, if not better, than many communities throughout the country. And that is not a sign that we should be resting. It's a sign that we should be following the lead of Indigenous communities and also respecting the work that they're doing within territories to protect all of us. So this is kind of the things that I do in our community. So I'm a speaker, I'm a professor at the University of Manitoba. I'm a speaker, I speak in different elements of the world, different places. So for instance, in these pictures alone, Indigenous studies is now a global phenomenon. And I think while it has always been a place in which it's been outward looking, it's always been a thing in which innovation and technology and growth has always been a part of Indigenous studies. Indigenous peoples advocating for themselves, thinking about relationships with others. That's what treaties are all about. Indigenous peoples constantly and continually inviting other peoples into dialogues and encouraging them to oftentimes partake in the cultural fabrics and the cultural communities in which they are becoming a part of. Not that we give up, that we join together to build those things. And of course, Indigenous peoples have invented some of the most important inventions in global history, democracy being probably the one that most immediately comes to mind. The idea of UN peacekeepers comes from Indigenous peoples. And many of the things in the world that we think of as, basic technology, ranging from the canoe to the hybridity of certain foods to medicines, all of these things have been invented by Indigenous peoples. And so I speak about that globally. So this picture, for example, is speaking, in 1 week, I could speak in The Hague, in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, just south of Amsterdam. And then in another week, you could be speaking at a grassroots function in downtown Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. That's the kind of world that Indigenous studies is. And in order to be a person working in the field of Indigenous studies, you really have to have the ability to be able to think globally, but then act locally, and also speak locally, act globally. And so you have to be able to multiply move in different areas at all times. And I'm not alone. I was part of a graduate cohort at the University of British Columbia. This is right here, everyone here. And University of British Columbia had a aggressive idea that they would produce 500 Indigenous PhDs from the years 2005 to 2010, and they eclipsed that by year 3, even though everybody told them there would be no ability, or there's no critical mass of Indigenous scholarship in the country. UBC eclipsed that by 2008, and not only that, is now talking about thousands of Indigenous PhDs, doctors, lawyers, leaders in communities, people's doing doctorates and entering into the professional faculties. And so there's a critical mass of Indigenous professionals across the country, much like myself, who are innovating, engaging, and thinking about these things and trying to articulate them in such a way that we can continue the traditions of treaty making, family making, and then also of peace. That's what Indigenous peoples are doing. We are not violent revolutionaries like you see in the media. We are certainly not protesters. We are protectors of the very fabric and principles in which this project called Canada has been built upon. And yes, as though Canada has not acted in such a way that they've been interested in those engagements, those gifts that I've talked about, democracy, peacekeeping, all those things like that, Indigenous people still continue regardless. And we do that because of our children. And so you can see River right here, one of my children, my daughter Sarah. I'm going to get her to wave as she's running out the door to go to her function for tonight when she comes downstairs in just a minute. And of course, all of us have different elements of our nieces and nephews and communities that we work for. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a brutal experience for everybody across the world, and it's been a brutal experience for everybody in terms of thinking about the impacts of what does it take to not only endure this crisis, but also think about the ways in which we can both resist and then also continue our lives despite of it. Now, this picture I took literally an hour and a half ago about the current situation of the pandemic in Canada. So we've got 148,000 cases, 127,000 of those are recovered, and then we're getting over 9,000 deaths. Just this week alone, we're looking in the cases of 1,200. And if you watch the Prime Minister's press conference yesterday, he reminded everybody that this is a time to clamp down, not to open up. And I don't think I have to speak to anyone in the East to remind them of that, particularly in Montreal and Toronto. And what the one COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us is that the sickness doesn't impact people the same. It impacts people differently according to your geographical space, your socioeconomic space, also your kind of place within society, or what we'll call class. And these are really big indicators here in Manitoba. And perhaps there is no place that has had a bigger spike in recent months than Manitoba. We've gone from virtually no cases, 1 or 2 a day throughout the worst parts of the pandemic in the first wave in other parts of the country. And we have spiked to the point in which we are surpassing everybody in proportional amounts of active cases. And that tells you a lot about Manitoba. Never really went through a first wave. We're going through the first wave now. And that tells you a lot about the situation in Manitoba, what's happening in Manitoba. And we can look to Manitoba as an example of what was done well and then also what was not done well. And this is a good example of perhaps while other communities never really had a chance to have an opportunity to see how the disease could be fought on a very stringent and strong basis, but they quickly had it right away and it spread very quickly. Manitoba had a long-standing policies in place in which we were able to withstand it, and then others can learn from that experience. Not only is COVID continuing to be uneven across the country, but it's also uneven when it comes to the racial mix of the country itself. So what we're finding, of course, is that within certain cultural communities, racialized communities, and communities that experience more poverty, they have been hit harder with COVID-19 than anybody else. And so undoubtedly, unsurprisingly, Indigenous peoples come into the conversation. Indigenous peoples globally have been impacted by COVID-19 throughout all elements of the world. And there was a lot of press and a lot of attention paid to the notion of what's often talked about as untouched or uninteracted with tribes in the Amazon or in the ocean and so on and so forth. But what I'm interested tonight in talking about is Indigenous peoples within cities and First Nations, and how is it that we can classify or examine the issues of COVID-19 and how that's been impacted within those two cultural communities. There was a study done by Statistics Canada, also many of the federal departments, to study what has been the impact of, if it hasn't been active cases on First Nations, and we're gonna talk about that in just a minute, what is the biggest impact of COVID-19 on Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities? And unilaterally across the board, it's been mental health, is the issue around mental health. The issue around trauma has exponentially increased, and that has been the biggest impact on Indigenous peoples. I'm a part of the Mama Bear Clan. So the Mama Bear Clan is a community group run from the North Point Douglas Women's Center, which is in one of the oldest areas of the city. North Point Douglas is very much run by previously by the Métis fur traders throughout the 19th century. It was really where all the wealthy Métis and French traders settled in from the Northwest Company. And while many of the British moved to more of the downtown area, what's often called Selkirk Avenue, or many immigrant populations, it was North Point Douglas that was really an affiliation with the French communities and the Métis. There was also a number of it was really the economic gasoline in Winnipeg's engine. And for many years, North Point Douglas was one of the hubs, one of the most important spaces in the city, but it's gone in disarray since, and it's become one of the most poverty-stricken areas in all of Canada. The amount of income and the proportional issues surrounding health, surrounding children in the child welfare system, incarceration rates are the highest in North Point Douglas. And they are higher than almost everywhere else in Canada. And what is virtually most of the people living in North Point Douglas? Well, they're Indigenous people. It is a de facto community of Indigenous peoples right smack dab in the middle of Winnipeg, to the tune of 90%, 80–90% in some neighborhoods. And so what we do as from the North Point Douglas Women's Center, we have an initiative called the Mama Bear Clan. It's been started by grandmothers and women, Indigenous women in the community, who wanted to deal with the issue of crime. They wanted to deal with the issue of child supervision, and they wanted to deal with the issue of health and safe food. And so what we do, and I've been part of the Mama Bear Clan for about a year, and but the program's been going for several years since. Has been started by some really remarkable women. I want to introduce you to them right now. This is Jeannie, Jeannie right here. This is Karen, and this is Karen. And they're three of the major captains within Mama Bear Clan. They lead the work that's being done, and they coordinate the food, and they also help coordinate the supervision. Right here, my brothers on the walk are Todd and Todd. Apparently we like similar names, Karen and Todd within the Mama Bear Clan. And we are all captains. Of course, there's myself right there. We're all captains within the Mama Bear Clan. And what we do is 2, sometimes 3 nights a week, we go out in the community and we distribute food. We also pick up needles right here, as you can see with my needle picker here. We also offer medicines to those on the streets who need them. And that's things like a smudge. We also offer kindness. We offer time, and we listen to people and their situations that they're dealing with. And I would say that that is the #1 thing we do. Food is impactful. Picking up needles is impactful. But by far the most biggest contribution, and no one else in the city does this. While there's other community patrols like the Bear Clan or the Downtown Biz Citizens Patrol, nobody deals with the issue of mental health like the Mama Bear Clan, because it's women inviting themselves into areas of the city that have been neglected and forgotten about, like Tent City in downtown. It's also been in various poverty-stricken areas. And for instance, they'll invite people into conversations of how are they doing? What's going on? What do you need? Many of the things that we support is we support many of the pregnant women in the tent city areas, because many street women, people who live on the street, women who live on the street, get into situations where healthcare is not a possibility. And so the leaders of the Mama Bear Clan take a lead on that. And I'm simply a Shkabewis, I'm simply a helper. But I want to show you what happened during the pandemic. From March to now, every single week we went out on Sunday night and Friday night and Tuesday night, and just the captains went out in a reduced capacity. And this is what we picked up. So this was one evening in about June in downtown Winnipeg. And this is exactly the kind of situation that we confront every week. And we confront situations involving poverty, atrophy, feelings of hopelessness. But that one night in June, at the height of the pandemic, in which what's the so-called first wave was happening all across Canada, we picked up this amount of needles, approximately 350 in about 1 hour, in one area of Winnipeg, which is called the Thunderbird House, which is an area in which many Indigenous peoples reside, hang out. Many of the shelters are within a block radius of there. So what does that tell you? Interestingly enough, at that time in Manitoba, there wasn't an issue with COVID. There was like one case a day. There wasn't an issue with the pandemic hitting the streets. And if anything, the pandemic had not really reached Manitoba. It had mostly truckers were getting the ones who were positive diagnosis. And if at all, there were people who were coming in from elsewhere. They were driving in from Alberta. We had a case in Manitoba, for example, of people from a Hutterite colony who traveled to Alberta, brought the sickness back. I had a friend of mine who came back from Australia, landed, and then had to self-isolate, and she had COVID-19. But yet, street people were not experiencing COVID-19, but yet the exponential increase in drug use and the exponential increase in conflict and violence on the street, resulting in people being over incarcerated and people entering into areas like emergency rooms, had exploded. In fact, if you go to the Health Science Center in downtown Winnipeg right now, you'll find that approximately 90%, 80 to 90% of the downtown hospital people in service patients are Indigenous peoples. The fact is that while cases on First Nations have been actively reported upon by the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, Mark Miller, one of the ministers, Carolyn Bennett is the other one, the numbers have been relatively low. There's been a number of criticisms around the numbers, around the ways that people report, much in the same way that we criticize the census. So the ability for the government to keep track of the issues on First Nations is almost impossible. So they don't do a particularly very good job. So as of today, there's 631 cases or so in Manitoba. There's only 8 on First Nations. But yet, why is it that we're seeing this exponential increase? And why also is there an interesting trend happening amongst Indigenous communities kind of unilaterally that's engaging the sickness on a front means, being probably one of the most active and engaging areas of resistance to the sickness on a community level for sure? And why is it that, how do those two things connect? The fact that the cases are fairly low on First Nations and the most active people in fighting the sickness is on First Nations or in Indigenous communities. Like, for example, this art piece right here, this is by Elizabeth Lapunce, who is a professor at Michigan State University, Anishinaabe, and she did an entire series of posters which have circulated around social media around using the language, learning the language, and then also wearing a mask. It is the first thing I want to say. It is the ability of First Nations to fight the sickness has not come from funding. Funding has been a part of it, but funding has simply offered people the opportunity to do what they had already been engaged upon. So funding, while it's been important, has not been very much. In fact, one of the things that I've articulated during the Indigenous Community Support Fund was $305 million was allocated to First Nations. So if you divide that up to the 640 First Nations that exist throughout Canada, the ones that are identified and recognized, that comes out to approximately the ability to buy one defibrillator, to maybe pay for one nurse, and then buy a few boxes of masks and sanitizer. That money doesn't go very far. And one of the things about that money that doesn't go very far is it's not targeted money for the real issues which have come into the pandemic, which I'll speak about in just a second, which is frankly mental health. If we only think of the issue as a physical sickness, then we miss out the major impacts of COVID-19. I don't have to tell you, and I don't mean to be a history on the issues involving Indigenous peoples and Canada, but all I can say is that Indigenous peoples in Canada have been driven into poverty, have been kept there. The Indian Act maintains that poverty structure, that power dynamic. And whether it be the manifestations of the Indian Act, residential schools, Indian agents, control of movement, or all of the things that have come since the 60s scoop, the over-incarceration rates, the overabundance of Indigenous children in the child welfare system, all of that has been a continuum and has created a situation in which Indigenous peoples suffer more poverty than anybody else. Disproportionately, they also have less success rates when it comes to high school. Many of us have family members who are in jail. Many of us have situations, it really doesn't matter if you got a PhD person with a PhD, or a person on the streets. We are generally treated the same when it comes to systemic racism, particularly when we go out in the community and we're working in the community. My point of saying it is, systemic racism is real. Even the Prime Minister recognizes it now. And many of these marches across the country are real. Police brutality is real. The disenfranchisement of Indigenous peoples on policies, urban or rural, is real. One of the impacts, Indigenous peoples are always at the sacrifice of politics. In Manitoba here, for example, almost all of the downtown core services, including the Mama Bear Clan, have had their funding cut leading up to the pandemic, as well as emergency rooms have been closed, which disproportionately affect Indigenous peoples because they're in poverty and use hospitals more. All the funding's been removed, and therefore all of the services that go into involve and support Indigenous peoples have all been taken out of the city and put into the rural areas, simply because the person who leads this province is invested in that as a voter base. I don't have to tell you that Indigenous peoples suffer from a great deal of racism in the country, and the racism is based on a very simple premise. Indigenous peoples are seen as deficient and savage and are in need to be treated as children, and that the rest of the country sees themselves as the solution, superior, and they are the ones who really make the rules and the policies. I don't have to explain much more than that to say that that's the Indian Act explained, that's the over-incarceration rate explained, that's the over amount of Indigenous children in the child welfare system explained. That's what that looks like, and there's a number of people who work in this area, so I'm not here to really just tell you about that, but when we add gang violence, poverty, child poverty, people living on the streets, when we add all that up, and that's all logical because of the Indian Act. The Indian Act produces that situation. All of that produces an ongoing mental health crisis in Indigenous communities. That mental health crisis is specifically around feelings of shame, feelings of hopelessness, and then dealing with a society that is very happy for that to continue and will maintain that and will offer you things like a shelter. And what I'm here to tell you is that from firsthand experience, shelters, while important, are not the solution to homelessness, to Indigenous homelessness. Shelters are a facet of helping, but they don't deal with the real problem. The real problem is that we continue to experience trauma in a state that is racist, and that continues to promote that racism in every aspect of its policy. And it's truly that racism which lives in the beliefs and the positions of society when it comes to Indigenous peoples that we must confront. Part of that evidence is that Indigenous peoples have been experiencing more severe trauma than anybody else, to the tune of 4 times. and that colonialism, and if we think of colonialism as that belief system in which Indigenous peoples are the colonized and there is a need for colonial control of those people, that the issue is that Indigenous peoples are constantly in need of situations involving mental health. And when I say mental health, I'm not just talking about crisis services, although I've worked in crisis services as well. I'm talking about positions of pride for our young people in which they can see themselves as worthy. And only ceremony, only other Indigenous people, only role models can do that. And that's why it's of a critical importance, where I started off today to say this critical mass of Indigenous professionals gives us an opportunity to, perhaps more than ever before, engage the issue of mental health amongst Indigenous young people who are in that situation of involved with trauma. Now, we know trauma. Indigenous peoples know trauma. I mean, if there's anything that we know trauma, we know it very well. And what I mean by that is we don't just know trauma in terms of the violence that we've experienced, but also the sickness. I mean, we can't forget that we can learn a lot from the 1919 Spanish flu. For instance, when the Spanish flu rampantly traveled across Canada and kind of devastated communities, Winnipeg was one of the front lines of that fight, mostly because Winnipeg is based on the train line. So the sickness got here very quickly and then spread very quickly. And what people noticed is that the Spanish flu began to exterminate Indigenous peoples very specifically. And not only that, but Indigenous communities were devastated beyond belief, beyond anyone else, disproportionately. And we saw a similar situation involving H1N1 a number of years ago, in which Indigenous peoples, when the sickness entered into those communities, it moved faster than anywhere else. And that was due to the issues of the lack of drinking water, a lack of overcrowding in houses, moldy houses. It also results in an ongoing situation involving close proximity that people have, not just in terms of a forced means like through poverty, but also through cultural means that people had, went out, and ceremonies are very close knit, for example. So Indigenous peoples learned from that pandemic from 1919, but it's not like we didn't know that from before. I mean, if you go back in time even further, we've known sickness going back to the numbered treaties. I mean, the very numbered treaties involved sickness and involved the impact on Indigenous communities and lives. Going all the way back to 1871, the very first moment of Confederation. Those treaties, also the pre-numbered treaties that go before Confederation. There's a reason why in Treaty 6, that Treaty 6 involves what's called a famine and pestilence clause. And Treaty 6, of course, Northern Saskatchewan, Northern Alberta, what that tells you is that in treaty time, sickness always joined with starvation. And one of the forces that Sir John A. Macdonald imposed on Indigenous peoples is a great sense of, great impact of starvation and keeping rations and goods and medicines from Indigenous communities, and so forcing them into treaty. But one of the impacts of that involves sickness, because smallpox doesn't come to people simply randomly. It comes when people are at their most health compromised. It comes when they're experiencing already a series of starvation. So Treaty 6 had a famine and pestilence clause. In fact, many First Nations during this time period, during this time of famine and pestilence, and I'll just pause for 1 second. I'll get Sarah to, I'll say bye to Sarah over there. So just come wave over here to everybody in Montreal. This is my daughter, Sarah, everybody. There they are. So,
hello.
Okay. And Sarah's off to her thing. So, okay, see you later. And so when you can look at Treaty 6, you can see the famine and pestilence clause that many people in Treaty 6 evoked during the pandemic. And what it was an assertion is that Canada had to provide medicines during times of famine and pestilence. And there was no better example than during the COVID-19 pandemic. And even go back even farther. Our creation stories, our spiritual stories, or what we refer to as the Atazukonic, are full of stories of famine and strife and sickness. In fact, many of our stories talk about how, when sickness arrives, oftentimes people forget about their relationships with each other. And because they forget about their relationships, sickness leads to violence and it leads to panic. And in fact, one of our great beings in our stories is the Wendigo, who is a all-consumer. And the Wendigo is very much a disease who, upon biting people in the stories, but perhaps spreading fear, spreading paranoia, it is the Wendigo who was the worst infector of communities. And that what it tells you is that in our spiritual stories, our Atazukonic, we have accounts for sickness and the impacts of sickness, but also the solutions. And in every single creation story that's being told about sickness, the answer is always based in community, sticking together, believing in one another, offering medicines when you have the least amount of medicine to offer, having leadership, or having an ogamak, or what we call chiefs, as having the least amount of a community, not the most. It involves turning inwards and committing to community more than ever before. Even because the sickness invites us to self-isolate, to divide, to isolate ourselves from one another. And the answer for Indigenous peoples unilaterally in the stories, found in the stories, is to come together the best way possible. Now, I could tell you I've dealt with pandemics. So one of the ways, in fact, that was the sickness involving smallpox on the plains. We also had ways in which we had medicines that dealt with the pandemic as well. But I want to just look at the ways that Indigenous peoples dealt with the pandemic this time around. Many of the communities, particularly here on the prairies, but in northern Quebec and northern Ontario as well, evoked what they called blockades. And they had check stops, oftentimes on highways, oftentimes in and out of communities. And this was generally covered by the media as Indigenous peoples protecting themselves. And rightfully so, makes sense. But in Manitoba here, almost every single First Nation, when they put up a blockade or a check stop involving checking for symptoms of COVID-19 amongst peoples, they did so on highways, Manitoba mainstream highways. In fact, there was a fear amongst the public that they were somehow disrupting cottage travel. And Indigenous peoples continued this, even though Manitoba had almost no cases, continued the check stops and the blockades to ensure the safety of not only their community, but isn't it interesting that Manitoba's numbers maintained such a low amount when you saw the most amount of blockades and check stops evoked by Indigenous peoples? And while Manitoba stopped their check stop program by police, First Nations continued it on. So it was Indigenous peoples, by evoking their sovereignty, that everybody benefited. Let me say it again. By Indigenous peoples evoking the rights to their territory, and not just territory that was on their little First Nations, the one they were forced to move to by Canada, but that their traditional historical used in occupied territory, things on highways nearby, in areas that were coming in and out of Manitoba. By Indigenous peoples evoking and using the principle of their sovereignty, they protected everybody. And they stopped the sickness from entering into Manitoba for months and months and months. That's why the blockades and check stops in Manitoba have restarted, and many of them have now gone on to protect small towns where Manitoba and Canada, frankly, are not protecting. This is not just the only initiative. There's many different initiatives that can tell you about Indigenous communities that are really cool and interesting. One of them is the medicine picking programs. It's kind of springing across Indigenous communities elsewhere. There's really great initiatives like the It's Not About You hashtag, which was started in Northern Ontario, involving elders reminding young people to wear masks and to self-isolate. At the University of Manitoba, as well as many other campuses, we did isolation powwows. So we had graduation powwows and ceremonies, but we had them at distance. And one of the other things that's happening is there's a great deal of amazing research that's happened. The Yellowhead Institute, for example, has done some great work on studying Indigenous peoples and the ways that they're responding to COVID-19. But many studies have said, hey, let's modify some of our traditions and some of our ceremonies. And if you look at the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, for example, they've done this innovative, brilliant thing in which one of the struggles of the sickness has been that there is issues around confidentiality and complexity involving keeping track of race when it has Indigenous peoples and related to the healthcare system. One of the things, accusations of the healthcare system, rightfully so, I just have to evoke the name Brian Sinclair, and you can Google that name if you want, but Brian Sinclair is a First Nations man here in Manitoba who spent 32 hours in an emergency room downtown and nobody helped him. He was in a wheelchair and he literally died in the emergency room waiting for someone to help him. He couldn't speak for himself, but nurses just walked by, doctors just walked by, nobody helped him. And that is a perfect example of how Indigenous people are treated in the healthcare system. So obviously Indigenous peoples don't want to share their racial data, but what the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs has done is they have offered to collect that data on behalf of Indigenous peoples and keep track of the sickness. And this is an innovative way that other Indigenous nations and community groups and organizations across Canada have looked to Manitoba as the model in which they're able to keep racialized data on Indigenous control. And every Friday afternoon, the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs holds a webinar in which they talk as a Indigenous-led coalition of governments across Manitoba about how they're handling the disease in individual First Nations and then collectively as well. So it's Indigenous peoples collectively working together to fight the sickness, and the evidence of that is clear. While Manitoba's spike has gone up exponentially, so leading the country, the impact of the sickness on First Nations is still minimal. We only have 8 cases. 2 of them are on my First Nation, Peguis First Nation in Manitoba. But the real thing I think that is important to work upon is the work that's being done by people, everyday people in the community, everyday Indigenous peoples who are going out and helping our relatives and telling them we love them. And like many of us who did this with our young nephews when our initiation ceremony, when we bring them out and we care about them and we tell them that they are beautiful and we tell them that they are worthy and we teach them how to make a fire, we are doing that with the Mama Bear Clan as well as many others. And I'm not the only one. There's many, many people who are doing this in different ways throughout our community. What we are doing is we are engaging the true impact of COVID-19, which is on mental health for Indigenous communities, which involved investment, commitment, time. Time is the biggest challenge in which to deal with mental health. Time is the hardest thing in which, that's the thing we have the least of, but that is the thing that we need to offer to Indigenous communities at the moment, because that is the way in which we will get through this sickness. By committing to each other, much like we learned from our creation stories, by committing to one another, believing in one another, coming together in a socially responsible way, in a health-centered way. You can notice that we're all wearing masks for the most part. I mean, sometimes when we're walking, it gets a little hot, but we're all wearing masks. We're all providing the same services that we've always provided. But what we have done is we've committed to a principle to never stop being there for our community, to turn to community, much like those who start the blockades, much like those elders in the old age home who start the hashtags to remind young people that they're loved and they should wear a mask, and much like those initiatives of humor. I think humor has been the one thing that's been the most beautiful, and I wanted to show you one thing before I end here. There's tons of really great, funny memes that have come out of this pandemic, and one of the things that's happened is people talking about the beauty of our culture and our community and how when we commit to each other, anything is possible. There's also some great stuff on YouTube videos that have been created and so on. And there's the one thing that's been really wonderful is that humor, like it has in the past, in fact, if you ever go to an Indigenous community and you go to a funeral, for example, it's a very sad time, of course, but it's also one of the funniest times. And humor has been the most important aspect of how we get through trauma, how we get through pandemics. It's been the stories that we tell one another about life that has fought off the Wendigo. It has been the initiatives that we commit to each other of offering medicines through story, through action, through song. That is what will get us through this commitment. And perhaps no more time than ever, that is the principle that is found within our creation stories, within our spiritual Adazukonic, which lead us through our Bagajanan, our gift giving to each other, which is that the gift of community, which will be the thing that will guide us through and be the most powerful medicine of all. So with that, I say a huge miigwech and thank you for your time. And I'm happy to have a conversation on some of these things involving sickness and community. Also happy to hear about your experiences out in Haudenosaunee territory, out there in Montreal. And, you know, certainly if you look at the history of Montreal, for example, 1701, the Grand Pays, the peace that was forged in Montreal in 1701 is something that was probably the most important aspect of Canadian history. And so it's worth reflecting upon of the peace that you have in your territory and how you can also guide during this conflictual time. So miigwech, and thank you very much. And I'll hand it back over to Christine.
Thank you so much, Niigaan, miigwech, for such a in-depth presentation about Indigenous resilience in face of the pandemic. It's really impressive, the kinds of stories that you've told and the evidence that you've provided, and that the importance of relation. And it's so interesting to think about that tension between isolation and relationship. And the pandemic seems to have moved us in a direction of isolation. And yet you're telling us something that another way of moving towards this that is more resilient, more healthy. So I'm really grateful for your talk. Now we do have some questions. We have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. And Matthew is going to moderate that, Matthew Anderson, Dr. Matthew Anderson. And so I think there are some questions, Matthew.
Yes, I'd like to say miigwech, Niigaan, and greetings from Treaty 4 territory, although also greetings from Nottingham, England, where I am right now.
I was going to say Treaty 4. Wow, like you're basically next door.
That's it. And
but you're not really. You're in Nottingham, right?
Well, that's right. I'm in Nottingham, but from Treaty 4, and so
okay.
I want to. There was a student who asked a question specifically about medical centers, but I think leading into that, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question and then come around again. So that you said by Indigenous peoples asserting their sovereignty, they protect everybody. And I wanted to ask you if for you that statement is connected to the nature of treaty as ongoing and constantly evolving, if those things are related or not.
Well, for sure. I mean, on Treaty 1 territory here, the best example, I think, is to think about of how Treaty 1 is the entire basis for the gasoline of Canada's economy. Like there is, what did Canada need at that point in which to take the next step to be able to protect itself, for example, against America or after the War of 1812, and to begin the progress of economic production, which unfortunately meant the end of the bison, meant the exploitation of lands, it meant the forcible removal of Indigenous peoples into territory. But Treaty 1 offered that possibility of relationship. And it was the entire reason, I think Canada forgets that the entire reason that Canada has an economy is because of Indigenous territories. And often the theft of those territories, the exploitation of those territories. But by evoking treaty, you can have an opportunity in which not only is a economy equitable, but it's a reminder that it can be just, that we don't have to have exploitation as a part of our worlds. And I think there's a really interesting study that came out just before the pandemic, and I think it was by CBC News, and it said that 80% of Canadians want poverty dealt with. And in the same poll, they said that 70% of Canadians want Indigenous peoples to do better, or to live better lives, healthier lives. Well, I mean, there's a direct correlation there, in that if you believe in justice, you believe in supporting Indigenous nations. Now, Indigenous nations don't need to remind themselves that by evoking our sovereignty, by telling Canadians that we're here, by evoking the protection of lands and waters and territories, which our clan systems demand us to do, that naturally benefits everybody. That's the whole principle of why we do it in the first place. Why we're walking, for instance, in honor of the bears, or we're Anishinaabe Rainbow Trout Clan. When we evoke teachings from the rainbow trout, and I bring those teachings around ethics involving the environment and water, or if we go out and we pick medicines from the earth itself right here in Manitoba, everyone's always worried about like, where are the medicines going to come from? Well, they happen to be right on the land, right over there. And the medicines in this territory, one of the things that we do with the Mama Bear Clan is we offer a smudge to the people on the streets. It's amazing to me how a smudge makes everybody calm. And oh, by the way, there's scientific proof for that. It's a relaxant. It's also an antibacterial agent for the air. So like, not only is a smudge good for everybody, but that by evoking what we, might be called a cultural right, it benefits everyone. And that, when the blockades and the check stops take place, I mean, they weren't just benefiting that First Nation, they were benefiting everybody. They were literally on the front lines fighting the sickness. And I think if you listen to the Prime Minister's speech yesterday talking about women as being the front lines of the sickness, it is Indigenous peoples who are also the front lines of the sickness. Indigenous peoples are the ones working the blue collar jobs. Indigenous peoples are the ones at the front lines in the grocery stores, or they're the ones who are on the streets, who are suffering when the library closes down. They're the ones who are, most impacted when the politicians send money elsewhere. Indigenous peoples are the front lines of the sickness.
Thank you so much for that. I'm just looking through some of the questions that are coming in the Q&A as well. And Liam asked the question, following on in what you said about the impacts of COVID-19, asking what's the impact, what are the impacts that you've witnessed on relationships between your particular community and other Indigenous communities, as well as on the community's relationship with the land?
Well, one of the most remarkable things, and I spent just a little moment talking about it, but I didn't want to spend a lot of time because it's not an initiative that we do here in Winnipeg or in this urban space that I live in, but it's something all my relatives did. And my sister particularly, my sister is a medicine keeper of our community, and she was leading medicine walks. But there were also many of my relatives, my nephews, who began food sovereignty projects in their communities because of the issues involving food distribution. And so communities were turning to traditional forms of hunting and fishing, for example, and food distribution as a result of that, and turning to our sacred stories, which say, when you bag a moose, when you catch fish, when you collect medicines, it's not your job to do that for yourself. You're doing that for everybody. And it's the job of you to, by gifting those to others, that's where that word bagajanan comes from. It means when you offer that others will pick that up, then they will leave it for you. That's where the word miigwech comes from. So when we say miigwech, it doesn't mean thank you. It means I will give on. I will give the way you have given to me. The word miigwe is the verb in that miigwech. And so the principle that we are embedded within our cultures itself is by turning to the land. All these really amazing initiatives happened that involved Indigenous peoples serving themselves within communities, medicines, food, also caring for one another when healthcare providers weren't coming up north. Healthcare initiatives within communities, particularly based in grandmothers, began to form within First Nations. And one of those initiatives, which has always been there that is often not talked about, is midwifery projects involving the delivery of children led by grandmothers. And those things were happening exponentially faster because First Nations said, well, we don't need just those services from the South. We can do things on our own. And I think it was a good wake-up call both for First Nations, but also a good reminder for Canadians that as a result, Indigenous peoples were doing more than their share, because name me a neighborhood in any Canadian city that did that. Name me a small town in anywhere that did those kinds of things. Like, you certainly didn't see small towns in Canada starting to evoke food sovereignty programs. Indigenous peoples were.
Miigwech, thank you. That's very helpful. I'm just going through some more of these questions, and I think a couple of them might be picked up by asking, at the very beginning of your talk, you spoke about your particular cohort at UBC, at the University of British Columbia, and talking about Indigenous professionals, people moving out into the various professions and PhDs and so on. And how does that work together? Just to segue from what you were just saying, how does that in your mind, what's the fruitful ways in which those things are combining with traditional knowledges and working together toward resurgence for Indigenous communities?
Well, the fact is that you can't be an Indigenous professional unless you, an effective Indigenous professional anyways, unless you have an ability to lead and to guide work that's working with Indigenous communities. You know, in segments of our economy here in Manitoba, we make up 20% of the general population. 20% of self-identified people in Manitoba are Indigenous. And I'm not just talking about status Indians, I'm talking about Inuit, I'm talking about Métis, I'm talking about recognized Indigenous peoples, never mind the ancestry issue. So for example, I'm not here to, you know, have the great debate on how much ancestry you need to make yourself Indigenous, because it's not really about blood, it's about relationship, it's about who claims you, not what you claim. But that being said, if the census reminds us that Indigenous peoples from 2006, 2016 went up 42.5%, that's not just babies, that's people self-identifying for the first time as being Indigenous across the country. And what it tells you is that to be an Indigenous professionals, you have the dual role of both working in the Canadian world, helping that Canadian world be less racist, because inevitably what's going to happen is somebody somewhere, something, you're going to be on some committee, you're going to engage an issue, you're going to be a mentor for those who are entering the profession. One of the things that I think is the most exciting for me being a professor is I'm mentoring all these young Indigenous professors where I never had a mentor. I didn't have one mentor growing up. I had nobody other than my father who worked in the law profession of somebody who had a university degree. I had no mentors in my life. And so the ability to be able to mentor young Indigenous people into professional capacities then therefore raises the level of competency, but also reduces the amount of shame, because not only do we service the workplace in which we're working, but we're also benefiting Indigenous peoples because we're opening doorways. And we're proving that the benefits of having an Indigenous employee. And frankly, if you cannot work with, live beside effectively, or you know, recognize the possibility that your family member will probably be married to an Indigenous person here in Manitoba, if you can't work effectively with Indigenous people, you're unemployable in Manitoba. Frankly, you don't deserve to have a job, because you are a hindrance to all of us. If you have racist views that taints workplaces, creates problems. Unfortunately, I think Manitobans like to pretend that this isn't happening, but it is happening in terms of 20%. You know, if you add up all the ancestry in Manitoba, you know, people could be calling themselves Indigenous 30, 40, 50%. The bottom line of it is that the amount of Indigenous professionals is the most important element of Canadians' economy, because not only are Indigenous peoples the fastest growing population, but the fact is that if we don't help Canadians to get out of racist pathologies, who's going to do that work? It's probably not going to be other Canadians. It's going to be Indigenous peoples who are leading the way in which that work, our allies who can then learn from us, walk with us, and then we can evoke change within the world itself.
Thank you. And I'm just picking up a question here. Maybe what I'll do there, by the way, I just want to pass on that there are many, many thank yous from the participants coming to you.
Miigwech, thanks everybody.
And just in terms of the question, there's a question from one of the participants. I'll just read it out loud. Greetings from Teodake. My name is Sabrina. I work with Catholic leaders of religious communities who have committed to responding to the CTA of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As religious men and women age, the concrete work of reconciliation seems harder to grasp. Can you speak to the desire for reconciliation from Indigenous intergenerational perspectives? And then, i.e., do Indigenous youth care for that with regards to churches, or has it become irrelevant versus elders? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a big question. So I'll tackle the first part, which is what's the hope for reconciliation as kind of a way to, you know, that, and I think we entered this pandemic in a really divisive situation, and especially with the Wet'suwet'en nations involving. The Wet'suwet'en situation brought up a lot of historical realities. And the reality is that Canada still continues a colonial violent relationship with Indigenous nations, forces them to only deal with their the chiefs that they recognize, not the actual chiefs that Indigenous peoples recognize, the hereditary chiefs versus the Indian Act chiefs, the imposition of projects that exploit Indigenous territories, and then the fact is that consultation is a sham. And so the Wet'suwet'en situation really brought up a lot of worms from the past. And then what we did is we entered into the pandemic where everybody was like, reconciliation's dead, reconciliation's dead, especially young people. Well, reconciliation never started. Like there's no beginning point. If there was a beginning point, it ended very quickly when the treaties were signed and we were forced onto reserves. Our lands were exploited. 99% of the land has been stolen. And then we're hammered into poverty. So there is no reconciliation to say is dead. So it never started. So the way that reconciliation lives, and how I tell people that it lives in the everyday. It lives in the actions of the everyday, not just in the way people act in their local economies, the ways that they, organizational, making a land acknowledgement is nice, and I do it as well. But then you have to realize the possibility that a land acknowledgement means the land must be returned. The land must be shared. The land must be honored. We cannot dump sewage into a river system and go, well, we acknowledge we're on Treaty 1 territory. Well, treaty is not with human beings. It's like with non-human beings, the water, the leaves, the trees, the plants, the fish. Like when you dump sewage into, if we're like, we acknowledge we're Treaty 1 territory, turn on the sewage and dump it in the river system. Well, we are violating treaty, and there's no point in saying the land acknowledgement. In fact, the land acknowledgement is a sham if we do those kinds of actions. And so the reconciliation lives in the everyday. We have to understand what it is. We have to therefore put it into our own lives. And then it goes from the micro to the macro. Then we demand that of our political leaders. We demand that of our everyday actions. We refuse to accept flowery language that involves, like, for instance, removing a statue of Sir John A. Macdonald. And I know you in Montreal have a particular interest in this. That's not reconciliation. Here's what's reconciliation. It's a little less violent because that statue has been removed. And so maybe the possibility now is that we can act more meaningfully toward one another. So the statue had to come down. I'm proud that it came down. I call it editing, that little head rolling on the ground there. Nothing's more symbolic, in fact, than what Sir John A. did to other people. But that's only the beginning of the dialogue. That's where we can actually see reconciliation for a moment. We're like, oh, well, there's the possibility. Let's have a conversation. Let's have an action now. And let's demand that of our political leaders. Because, like, for instance, Justin Trudeau likes to say, well, tainted water, we repaired tainted water and there's still 100 boil water advisory committee in communities right now. We've repaired 38 last year. That's not reconciliation. That's called treating people like human beings. So let's define what reconciliation means that it's a relationship that's ongoing. That means we have to be equitable in every aspect of our lives. We have to share all the resources, share the lands, and most importantly, invite Indigenous peoples into co-governing the country. If that's, that's where the real radical ideas are. It's within the Royal Commission of Aboriginal People. If you're going to really truly grasp the idea that Indigenous peoples matter, don't pretend they don't. Don't pretend Indigenous languages are second place to English and French. Don't pretend that Indigenous nationhood is some kind of municipality. Don't pretend like Indigenous nations haven't been stolen. And that was probably didn't even answer 1/5 of that question, but I did the best I could.
I appreciated it. Thank you very much. I'm
reminded. Or, something about the Catholics, I'll say one thing about the Catholics. The fact is that if Catholics think that a pope not apologizing means something, look at all the Indigenous Catholics out there. The bottom line of it is that if the pope doesn't recognize genocide, then Catholicism in Indigenous communities is a sham. If the very leader of the church if the very leader of the church doesn't recognize that genocide happened and that the Catholic Church was a part of that, if the Pope refuses to acknowledge that possibility, frankly, the Catholics don't have a leg to stand on Indigenous communities. They don't. And so that means you have to either act in contravention of your own Pope, which I know is not easy, or you have to act in such a way that you can advocate and remind those in the leadership in the Catholic Church that this matters. These are important instances. We can't just pretend this isn't happening. And I know the apology is not reconciliation either, but it's a step. It's a facilitation of less violence.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to maybe pull privilege just for a second and ask you in terms of for us, those of us who are non-Indigenous Canadians, in terms of, you talked about reconciliation, it's not dead, it hasn't started. Can you tell us something about the importance of decolonizing ourselves before we can be allies in terms of decolonizing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a complicated question because it's like, what is it that's decolonizing, right? And I think one of the things that I most often ask people to do is I ask people to be empathic and to begin to think about the experiences of others. And that will lead you to a position of inward looking, and it will look to see in which what you'll notice is a number of things. You'll notice how you have benefited greatly from the violence against Indigenous people. And you'll say, like, the first thing that you do is you look around, you'll say, like, why is our society so disproportionately against Indigenous people? Why are there more people in the jails? Why more children in the child welfare system? More people poor on the streets? And why is it that we don't see any Indigenous peoples in Parliament? And then when they, when we do work very hard, make it into Parliament, get into cabinet, then an Indigenous person acts Indigenous and get kicked out of cabinet. No surprise that there's racism within the very upper throes of government. So ask yourself, look and say, okay, be empathic. Don't judge that. Ask yourself, okay, why is that the way it is? And it'll demand you to look inward eventually, where you'll say, wow, I have benefited greatly off the violence of Indigenous people. My generations have benefited from these territories, most of whom have been stolen. And not only that, but I've been also taught not to think of Indigenous peoples as a part of my lives, contributing democracy, contributing the names that are on my driver's license, contributing all the stories that make up this place. Like Canada is supposed to be the village, right? It's named Iroquoian word, which means village. So we all carry these relationships with one another. Indigenous peoples have gifted those to us. That means I have a relationship with Indigenous peoples, whether I know it or not. And then you go, well, how do I act differently when that's my relative? Like, if you look at me right now and you say that, like, I want you all just for a moment, try this. Niigaan's my brother. He's my cousin. And now how do you act when I'm a part of your family, when I bring these views at the kitchen table, when I bring these views into your workplace, when I'm your nephew and I'm saying these things, that to love me means that you're going to help our community in such a way that you treat us as our nephews. You'd never let your nephew or your cousin or your brother go hungry. You'd never let your cousin or your brother or your nephew have tainted water. You'd never let your cousin or your brother or your nephew be beaten by police officers. You'd never let that happen. And that's when you begin to see what a decolonized world looks like. And that's also, by the way, a treaty world. That's what the treaties were supposed to do. Treaties were supposed to create family-making mechanisms all across segments of the economy. In fact, this situation involving the Mi'kmaq out in the eastern coast right now, involving Canadian fishermen who are acting completely lawless and attacking people for revoking their own rights, simply over 350 traps. Meanwhile, those Canadian fishermen put up 325,000 traps. So who is the actual problem here? Who's exploiting the lobsters? But it's the Canadians who are acting lawless and Mi'kmaq are just evoking their rights and getting a very moderate living off of 350 traps. The situation that came from a treaty in 1760 where the Mi'kmaq signed with those who they were sharing territory. Later would be the formation of Canada. And that's simply just to say that we will live together peacefully. We'll all take care of one another, and we will take care of the lobster. We will take care of the water. We'll take care of each other in such a way that we will continue our lives forever. And that means we all have to gift that. We have to come with gifts into that relationship. It starts with empathy.
Thank you very much for that. I see several miigwetches and more words of thanks to you. And there was a question, I think probably from somebody who's asking, what are respectful ways to approach and best sorts of help to provide if talking to a person who happens to be homeless who's Indigenous on the streets of Montreal? What's a respectful way if that person should happen to be Indigenous, I guess?
How to greet that person?
I guess, and how to offer help, I guess. I'm not sure entirely what the question is.
My experience with homelessness and individuals who are homeless is the situation is always immediate. It's usually that day people need something just to get a place to sleep for tonight, or food for today, or to get through the trauma that they're engaging with. And frankly, trauma is the #1 enemy of the streets. It is what creates people into dealing with drug addiction or alcohol addiction. Trauma is what leads people to losing their children. Trauma is what leads people to react negatively when it comes to dealing with institutions. So, for example, while we do live, as I mentioned before, in a society that's thoroughly racist, it's also full of people who are constantly traumatized by that racism. And so that leads into situations of almost hopelessness, because not only are you fearful of the society, but you're also very aware that there's no one going to be looking after you but you. And so, and that's why those tent cities are so important for Indigenous peoples, because it's the one place you find community. It's the one place you find supports and love, and that somebody will care for you and keep an eye on you. And that's what our ceremonies and stories were supposed to do. And our ceremonies and stories are reminders of how important it is that we come together, as I mentioned in the presentation. So what can you do when you meet a person on the street? Well, realize that they're living in the immediacy, they're living in the now. And so if you can help them in a positive way to deal with that immediacy, and you have the means to do so, I think it is all of our responsibility to think of our relatives as relatives, and to treat people as though they are your cousin, whether they're your nephew. And the second thing is what I would say is if the real change, however, will come from the long-term investments that you advocate in your communities, that you support yourselves, that you demand support for in terms of mental health services, the real kind of ways to deal with trauma, which is that we can't pretend that trauma isn't happening. We have to deal with the reality that trauma is in the everyday. It's within the politicians, it's within the institutions. It's also within the everyday magazines and movies that are produced involving, characterizing Indigenous peoples in particular ways. For instance, we just did a colloquium this past week on Oka, on the anniversary. Ellen Gabriel came on and spoke. And what she says is that things have actually got worse since 1990. And predominantly because people keep personifying Iroquois people, Haudenosaunee people, as violent people when they're not. They are protectors. They are engaged in a relationship building, and they would like to invite the rest of Quebec to stop being so violent, to stop trying to take the land, stop trying to assert that they own the land when they don't, and most importantly, stop being so racist. Stop sending officers who are inappropriately trained. Stop sending politicians. Stop voting in politicians who are so racist when it comes to viewing Indigenous peoples, and stop continuing these policies which hammer Indigenous peoples into poverty. And everyday Canadians have a role to play, because you can demand more than this country has inherited.
I'm going to come in here now, Niigaan, and I think that you can hear me okay.
Yeah, I can hear you fine. Yeah.
That's good. So I know we do have some more questions, but I think we need to give you a little bit of a break. You've been talking for a while, but I really want to say a few things just to thank you. Number one, I'm so glad that this recording was, your talk was recorded, because there's so much depth in what you have to say. And really, I think your whole approach is so important, and it's a very profound communication. And I just encourage you in your work and to continue to communicate these important messages, not only to Canada, but to beyond. So thank you so much for taking the time. We're really honored to have you, because I know you're a very busy person. So I want to thank you very much. I want to thank people who attended for the excellent questions, and I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. I do also want to just mention that we're having our next talk on October the 19th with a woman named Sonia Bonsfield-Boileau, who is a Mohawk filmmaker. And I think she's going to come at our theme of spirituality as land, stories, and relations from a different perspective. But I think we're going to see a lot of interesting convergences. So thank you again, Niigaan, very, very much.
My only request is that when this pandemic's over, that I still get to come to Montreal.
Absolutely. We're already saving up to get you out here.
Just, you know how many flight credits I have? I'm not sure if we booked, because I was originally going to fly out there. I'm not sure if we even booked that, but
No,
I'd be honest, I just love Montreal so much. I love being there. I love the food. I love the people.
You know what? We have this recorded, so we're going to hold you to this. We'll have you out here, believe me.
Well, I've been there I come out every year for the University of Montreal Cerium.
Yes.
And I've taught Indigenous literature there with Sarah Hensey a number of times. And so I mean, the fact that I wasn't able to do that this year, I'm just really, really sad, because I love hanging out there. In fact, this tattoo right here comes from Montreal. So there you go. Beautiful,
beautiful. Well, thanks again, Miigwech, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you so much.
Miigwech, Niigaanwewidam, Minowa, everyone. Thank you. And merci. Take care.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.